brother Kevin was also elected to the state legislature, making them the first brothers to serve together in the state house. In 2014, Congressman Boyle pulled off an upset win over three better funded rivals to be elected to Congress. For 2 terms, he served on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman Boyle represents areas that include Northeast Philadelphia, parts of North Philadelphia east of Broad Street, as well as portions of the River Wards. He serves on the House Ways and Means Committee, the House Committee on the Budget. He is the co-founder of the Blue Collar Caucus, which advocates working for families by addressing wage stagnation, job insecurity, and the future of work. He lives in the area where I grew up, the Somerton section of Philadelphia. I am a Northeast Philly girl, Brendan. He's married to his wife is a teacher, and he has a young daughter. Some interesting things that you might not know about Brendan, one of which is he has the best Twitter feed ever. So if you want some entertainment and knowledge, follow Brendan Boyle on Twitter. He is the sponsor, which I love, of the Stable Genius Act, which nominees for elected office need to have a medical exam. Brendan, on a more serious note, best reflects DJOP's Jewish progressive values. He's in the forefront of speaking out on behalf of working men and women for fair wage. He supports unions. He supports a woman's right to choose. And he reflects the diversity of his district. So with that, I would like Brendan to say a few words, and then Brad will say a few words, and then we'll engage in some conversation. So why don't you take it away, Brendan, then when you're done, hand it over to Brad.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Jill, so much for that great introduction. And it's also wonderful to join my colleague, Brad. He and I seem to always be together. We served on the Foreign Affairs Committee together, sat only a couple seats apart, and now we sit only a few seats apart on the House Ways and Means Committee. I also have to say it's very nice to be looking at a group here where I am friends with a significant number of the people who are on this Zoom, and a few of you I haven't seen in a little while because you're former constituents of mine from when I used to represent Montgomery County, either in the State House or in U.S. Congress. So for the number of friends I have on here, it's great to see you again, and to folks in the Chicagoland, it's nice to meet you. While I am biased toward Philadelphia, I would say Chicago is absolutely one of my favorite cities, with the exception of November through March. Having lived that winter 4 years in a row, I never again. But it's a great city the other months of the year. We share obviously many of the same values, so I applaud the leadership some folks exercise in creating this organization. I think it is incredibly important and serves a very noble purpose. I think it is also just so important that those of us who are from the left of center, broadly defined, whether center left or very far left or somewhere in between, I think it's important that we speak about where we are politically in terms of representing our values. One of my great pet peeves, and I was recently quoted, I gave this quote in a Washington Post article not too long ago, that I think for too long in my lifetime, values voter has been a euphemism to describe people on the right. I think that is both wrong and offensive. The reason why I am such a staunch Democrat is because it is a reflection of my values. And I know I'm speaking for a number of you when I say that. So why don't I just pause there and hand it over to my great colleague, someone who, for better or worse, tends to see the issues in the political world extremely similarly to the way I do, and just a great person, my colleague, Brad Schneider.
Thanks, Brendan. And Jill, Dana, Steve, thank you for organizing this. I'll echo much of what Brendan said. First, or reflect, It is such an honor to serve with Brendan on the Ways and Means Committee. It was great being with him on the Foreign Affairs Committee. We do have similar worldviews, but I think those start with the foundation of a belief in family, a faith in community, an idea that the United States can lead on the global stage and make the world a better place. And that's what we're trying to do. So it's a great honor to be with you and to share this audience. Like you, there's so many people. Now I just see Brendan, but before, when I had the grid, I had so many other people that I could see, and some of the comments from people in Pennsylvania and Illinois, even Marvin, thanks for the note from Wisconsin. So it's so good to have so many people on this call. We are always in the midst of the most important time, the most important election for our country. And of course, it's no different now, but this one just feels differently. There's so much at stake, so difficult, the many challenges we face. Not just the pandemic, you get global climate change, you get the challenge of getting our economy back on track and helping to restore the education for our kids who have had certainly an experience of the last 12 months, but it's an experience that's going to have ripples over the rest of their lives. And I want to make sure that those ripples become minor fluctuations in their path to reaching their full potential. So these are the things that we're facing. Look forward to talking to everybody, and rather than hearing us on a monologue or a dialogue, why don't we jump to the questions?
Great. Thank you both. We are so lucky that President Biden signed the COVID relief bill into law. Can you tell us a little bit about what this package will do for each of your districts, but also for the country nationally? I know it's a very big bill with a lot in it, so we'd like to hear from you. Why don't we start with Brad and then we'll move to Brendan.
Great. Thanks, Jill. Look, this is a massive bill, $1.9 trillion. It's probably better to describe it as $1,900 billion, and it does quite a bit. Let's start with the basic needs. First and foremost, putting shots in people's arms. The investment it's making in vaccines to try to accelerate the rollout of the vaccine program, as we are in literally a life and death race, trying to get more people vaccinated before these variants take hold. And the expectation, I was reading about this afternoon, we are probably going to be vaccinating for an extended period of time. So having that science, developing those technologies to make sure that we're keeping Americans safe is key. It also is going to help Americans who are struggling. The $1,400 direct checks, so people are trying to put food on their table, keep the roof over their heads. I spoke today with an apartment association, just hearing the number of people who are behind in rent and just struggling to make ends meet. This will help with that. And those who have lost their jobs, I think it's the latest number is 18 million people collecting unemployment. 4 million or more of them on extended unemployment have basically been out of work this entire pandemic. I have a constituent, I was talking to his spouse, just got a job, is now doing a 3.5 hour commute from our district up to Wisconsin for work, but he's been out of work since September. The American Rescue Plan extends unemployment insurance through the summer to make sure those people looking for jobs, as the economy gets to recovery, will be able to find it. It helps the communities these people are living in. We've been struggling to get relief. The first responders, firefighters, departments of health at the county and city levels have all been struggling. This gets money to those people, and it helps small businesses, the businesses that have been hanging on by the skin of their teeth. My wife and I had lunch at a pizza parlor. Those of you in Illinois were at Il Forno's in Deerfield, maybe a little commercial, sitting outside having lunch on a nice March day. But talking to the owner's daughter, they didn't know they were going to make it in January, February, I guess December, January, February, and just were able to hold on until March. Extending the PPP program adds more help. There's so much more in there. The child tax credit, maybe I'll let Brandon talk about that. Lifting half of America's children living in poverty. This will lift them out of poverty and put them on a path to hopefully success and potential. So there's more. I'll let Brandon pick up from there.
Brendan, if you can talk about, particularly schools too, and and Northeast Philadelphia has a lot of people who are really impacted, by this pandemic in many ways too. If you could speak to that and anything else you want to say about what is in the bill. And before you answer, if anybody has a question, please put it in the chat. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Brendan.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so rather than all of what Brad said was correct, rather than repeating that, I'll just supplement it. And right where he left off was talking about the child tax credit, expanding it. Understand that by simply expanding the child tax credit, we are projected now to cut through this bill child poverty by 50% in the United States of America. That will be the most significant progressive reform when it comes to child poverty since the 1960s, since the great anti-poverty programs of Lyndon Johnson and that famous 1965 huge Democratic majority that created so much. So you have that. In addition to that, and as I have, you might not be able to hear her, but I can hear her as I have a 7-year-old in the house running around who, for the first time over the last week and a half, is now physically in a first grade classroom after spending most of her first grade experience sitting at her kitchen table in front of a laptop. Obviously, it's very important to me that we safely get teachers and kids back to school. The other aspect of that is my wife is a public school teacher. So I'm especially excited that there's 148 billion or just over 125 billion, closer to 140 billion for getting schools reopened, but doing so safely. So that in and of itself, as a standalone bill, would be crucial. But then when you think of the fact that it's as part of this larger $1.9 trillion package, there's probably the danger that not as many people are aware of this and very important aspect. Now, in terms of, Jill referenced the distributional challenges, in other words, the ways in which COVID has affected people differently. That's why you sometimes hear the term a K-shaped recovery. Because let's face it, for those of us who are essentially in the knowledge economy, this has been one kind of experience. COVID has been just a massive disruption. It's been a pain. However, if you are in a job like mine and like many of ours, you're able to do it via Zoom. You're able to work remotely. And the impact you have faced is not detrimental to your overall income. However, if you're in a blue collar job, if you're in a job that can only be done in person and exposes you to a lot of people, particularly in a tight enclosed area, this has been devastating. If you're in the hospitality industry, restaurants, this has also been devastating. And now, it's interesting. I'm in my fourth term, but I've represented two different districts in Congress. One, for my first 4 years, was, I think, I sense a pretty similar area to Brad's, a more suburban type district, roughly half in more middle class and working class parts of Northeast Philadelphia, and then the other half in more middle to upper middle to affluent parts of Eastern Montgomery County. Now I'm in my second term representing a very different kind of congressional district. I represent about one half of the city of Philadelphia. And the new parts of my district are places that have many impoverished zip codes in primarily African American and Latino parts of North Philadelphia, as well as some up and coming and very exclusive neighborhoods that abut downtown. So the experience for folks in my district who live in North Philly and the very Latino wards of North Philly, the amount of poverty going into this was quite large. And then when you add COVID and total shutdowns on top of it, it's been devastating. We're not even talking about a recession. We're talking about a full economic stop. So the American Rescue Plan is absolutely needed for all of us, but especially for those aspects of our economy that have been the hardest hit from COVID. And I would ask all of us to keep them in mind when we think about just what an important role government is needed to play in our recovery.
Great. I have more of a political question in that, 70-some% of all Americans on a bipartisan basis support this bill, yet 100% of Republicans voted against it in both the House and the Senate. I don't understand how that helps Republicans strategically, because once people start getting money in their bank accounts and monies go to restaurants and other businesses, it will be the Democrats that can take full credit. So I would like to hear from both of you, since you work with these Republicans, what maybe their thought processes are, and what you think will happen in elections going forward based on these votes. We'll start with you, Brendan, and then go to Brett.
Yeah, well, it's a great question, Jill. I would just add one other polling data point to what you said. Well over 70% of the American people support this act. That includes approximately 60% of registered Republicans. So it is pretty remarkable when you consider this bill is supported by about 60% of Republicans nationwide and was supported by 0% of elected Republicans in Washington. But it speaks to this sort of partisanship, and what I would more accurately say negative partisanship that we have in the country. But let's not do the false equivalency thing. It is much more acute on the Republican side, that there is such a high penalty Republican politicians feel that they will face in a primary if they, God forbid, actually act bipartisan once or twice in a congressional session. Now, I am hopeful that this will be a reason why we can turn history on its back coming next year. I mean, when I say history on its back, the fact of the matter is the history of midterm elections overwhelmingly do not favor the party that controls the White House. And that's especially true when it's the same party that holds power in not just the White House, but in Congress. However, there have been a few exceptions. And I'm hopeful that this clear dividing line on the American Rescue Act could be a way that, provided we go on offense on this, and that we don't let people forget about what's in this bill, and that every single Republican opposed it, I'm hoping this could give us a pretty big ammunition going into the 2022 midterm elections.
Brad, are your thoughts on that?
And I think Brendan's right. I can't say baffled because I've worked with these people long enough, but it used to be there were geographic or regional differences between parties. The Northeast Republicans were more like Democrats than maybe the Southwest Democrats. There was, you couldn't judge, but right now there seems to be uniformity, but not in the way you think. The country, as you noted, as Brendan noted, 60% of Republicans support the American Rescue Plan. The American people saying we need to come together, lift people up, and give them the hopes for a recovery and for a renewal, so that our future is at least as good and worthy of what our parents have sacrificed, grandparents have sacrificed for us. And yet, within the confines of the Beltway, you had not just a majority, you had an absolute totality of Republicans voting against this package, every single one of them. I think you don't need to look past the craven members who went home and took credit for a bill they just voted against to understand that this is not tenable. So we desperately need a loyal opposition. Sometimes it's the Democrats, sometimes it's the Republicans who are going to stand up and challenge ideas in a way that should hopefully make them stronger. But what we're seeing currently in Washington is people falling in line to try to make sure nothing good happens so that the Democrats have nothing to brag about. Well, the fact of the matter is this bill is going to do a lot of good. It's not perfect. There's things I might like to have done differently. I'm sure there's things Brendan would have liked to have done differently. But net, the economists say it's going to bring our economy back to full employment next year rather than 3 to 5 years from now. We've already talked about lifting children out of poverty. It's going to give people the opportunity to have healthcare that didn't have it before. All of those are positives that I'm happy to stand on and say I'm proud to have helped make this happen.
Great. So Brad, I'll continue on this line and ask the same question of Brendan. From a strategic perspective, what can we as Democrats do to hold the House and Senate in 22? It's very concerning. We now have Biden as president, but most Democrats I talk to are very worried that we're very close in the House, and you hear Leader McCarthy out there talking about how he would bet his house that he's going to win the House, and there's issues with regard to the Senate. What do you think we as Democrats need to do, and what are the keys to winning? And you can start, and then we'll go to Brendan.
I'll divide that question between what we as elected representatives have to do and then what we collectively as Democrats in the country have to do. Those of us representing you, serving in Congress on both sides of the Capitol, we have to deliver good governance. We have to ignore the noise. We can't take the bites. We can't bite the attacks about Dr. Seuss or Mr. Potato Head. We have to say what people need are the opportunities to achieve their dreams, to provide for their families, to strengthen their communities. And if we do that, if we show the American people that we can deliver results that will make a difference in their lives, improve the quality of their lives, we'll have done what we have to do. But that's not enough. Necessary, but not sufficient. That's why all of us together as Democrats have to work to get that message out. What you all are doing by being involved here, talking to your friends, talk to friends, to family members, to strangers, to make sure they understand what actually is happening. We are fighting an information battle every much as we're fighting a political battle, and we've got to get our information out. Your support for candidates like Brendan and me makes a difference, but the work you do as individuals, both in an organized fashion, whether it's organized through the work in Pennsylvania's DJOP, in Illinois, many of you are part of 10 Thems in my district, or if it's just your own engaging people in conversation and talking politics in a constructive civil manner, we've got to get back to that if we're going to hold power and govern in a constructive way.
Great. Brendan?
Yeah, I agree with everything Brad said. And I'd also point out that, you know, from the people I know who are on this Zoom call, you're a pretty smart, politically sophisticated group who have been around campaigns and elections for a while. So I think that this group, probably more than most other just regular voters, would kind of know already what to do in terms of the importance of organizing, the importance of getting other people involved and engaged, just to set the stage. While we currently have a small majority in the House, when you take into account that redistricting will tilt Republican, we probably will be entering the 2022 midterm elections at roughly parity, holding approximately an equal number of seats. Redistricting will not be, the maps will not be as bad for us as they were in 2010, just simply because Republicans don't have as many trifectas now as they did then, but they still have the vast majority of trifectas, especially in Florida and Texas, where 7 new seats are being added. So those 2 states alone actually bring us at parity going into 22. I have to decide whether or not I want to keep just saying, we're going to call it 22 from now on. Let's just make it easier. So one other thing that I would add to this, though, is, and this is always the challenge our side has, and that is a depressed turnout when it's not a presidential election. Donald Trump was in some ways the best asset we had, because he was able to gin up our voters in 18, actually, as well as in 17 and 19 for local and judicial elections. We, thank God, no longer have President Trump, but what that means is we need to get our side as excited to be supporting something affirmatively as our side was excited to stand up to something that was negative. And in some ways, that's a little bit more of a challenge for us.
Great. I want to turn your attention, and I'll start with you, Brendan, then we'll go to Brad, to HR 1, the voting rights legislation that the House passed and then is in the Senate now. It's a really important piece of legislation as it relates to these 22 elections. If you look around the country, state legislatures, if you look at Georgia, you know, giving someone a water bottle while they wait in line is a crime. Pennsylvania, they're trying to do stuff, and a multitude of other states. Could you talk about what is in that bill? Because I don't think a lot of people know. They know it as the voting rights bill generally, but talk about what's in the bill, why it's so important, and what we should do to pressure the Senate to pass it.
Yeah, well, first, for my Chicago friends on this, let me do a little rough translation. a water bottle is what you would call a water bottle. Um, so, I having lived in both areas, I know when I need to translate. But seriously, HR1, and I would combine it also with the soon to be passed John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Those two taken together, I think, represent some of the most important, if they were to pass, most important new laws regarding voter access, again, since the 1960s. And I don't say that out of hyperbole or exaggeration. There is no question that when you look at what's in, just take HR1, the fact that it would set a minimum floor federally that overnight would knock out a bunch of these individual state measures, both that exist already and that are now, suddenly you see, including in Pennsylvania, Republican controlled legislatures attempting to create new restrictions. Obviously, they're doing the same thing in Georgia and Arizona. They've been doing that in Wisconsin. But when I think it's something like now 39 of the 50 states have at least one measure that a Republican state legislator has introduced that would restrict the right to vote. It shows you why you need that minimum federal standard. It would also create it would end the dark money feature that has existed since Citizens United, when Anthony Kennedy famously and incredibly naively predicted that surely Congress would immediately move to institute full disclosure when Citizens United, which did a lot of damage to our system, one of the things they did was allow for dark money to exist. HR1 would also eliminate gerrymandering in the United States of America. We saw in Pennsylvania what a difference it made once we were able to eliminate gerrymandering for our congressional districts, which is how I ended up representing two different districts. Not that I had a gerrymandered district before, but I had a district in which the Republican controlled legislature in 2011 packed as many Democrats into it as possible so they could carve out 3 Republican leaning districts in the suburbs, including one district that was so oddly drawn that it essentially became the national poster boy for gerrymandering throughout the country. I think it was said it looked like Donald Duck kicking Goofy, or
That was my district.
that was your so the old PA7
Yeah.
literally looked like 2 characters out of Disney. So those are just a few of the things that are in HR1. Incredibly important that we not only get both through the House. We've already gotten one through the House, but we need to get both, and we need to get both through the Senate.
Brad?
I think Brendan covered the key components. Giving people faith in our electoral process again is crucial. And the idea that in our constitutional republic that is built on the premise that every citizen has the right to vote, we need to make sure that the right is translated into the ability to vote, that they can register, and this takes steps on that they have access to the polls, we have steps on that their votes will be counted, and that we all can have trust in the outcome of our elections. We have a very unfortunate circumstance where one party believes in that principle to its core. I think that defines us and is embracing that principle, combined with the principle of the richness, the rich mosaic of our nation being something to be proud of and to promote. And another party realizing that they've adopted policies and priorities that reflect a shrinking number of people are committed to holding power, and that the only way they can hold power is to suppress the vote. And that is the battle we're facing. I mentioned 39 states where there's at least one thing on the books, and that number is growing. So we passed it out of the House now twice. We'll pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. It's all coming down to the Senate, and becomes a question of the filibuster, whether with the filibuster, whether Joe Manchin's proposal, make them really work for it and have to speak on the floor until they can't speak any longer, or other steps. We've got to get back to governing and get our elections back into the hands of the people.
Great. Another issue that's been bubbling up in the news for the last few days is immigration. There's a flow of children coming across the border. We're running out of places to put them. It seems to me that the problem, we're the end point of the problem. The problem originates in the countries from which they are fleeing, where there is horrible poverty and horrible crime. What, from a foreign policy perspective, can we do? And then what should we be doing with respect to these children who are flowing over our border? And then lastly, do you believe the House will pass any sort of immigration law this year, whether it's small individual pieces to deal with the children or a larger piece? Brad, then Brendan.
Thanks. Crucially important question. I'll start at the end. Yes, I do believe the House will pass immigration law this year, both in pieces and ultimately, hopefully, a comprehensive bill. But I believe this week we're voting on the Dream and Promise Act to support those dreamers. But at the end of the day, we've had a broken immigration system for a generation or more. We need to fix that. We need comprehensive immigration reform. And I'll be clear, that includes modernizing and ensuring we have border security as well, but smart border security that's using technology, reflecting our passion. I'm going to go back and forth. So let me go down to the beginning of your question and talk about, you asked, how do we slow this tide of immigrants? There's no one simple answer, but certainly part of it is addressing the problems in the home countries. These kids aren't leaving because things are good where they are. They're leaving because things are unbearable where they are. A few years ago, in fact, I had this young man as my guest in the Capitol. I met a young man when he was 5. He was kidnapped by these gangs in Honduras. He was held for just a few hours, but his family had to pay a ransom. And they told him if they didn't pay again, they would kidnap him again. And they got him up to the United States, fleeing the threat of extreme violence that I can't even begin to comprehend. So addressing at the root cause, it has to be a part of it, as well as fixing our immigration reform. And the last thing I'll say, and I'll throw it to Brennan, I'm sorry, there's just so much to touch on. I could spend the whole hour on this. The Republicans are trying to say that what we're seeing now is the same as what we criticized the last administration for. Nothing could be further from the truth. What we're seeing now is a crisis. Be very clear, and we have to address this crisis. And the president's called in FEMA, and we've got to work to take care of these young children and make sure that we're staunching the flow from the countries they're fleeing. But in the prior administration, kids were put into detention centers because they were explicitly or specifically being taken away from their families. The Trump administration was separating these children and putting them in basically wire cages. That is not what is happening now. We have to mobilize our country. We have to do everything we can to treat these young children and young people with dignity, and recognize that this is a real problem. But it is not what we saw with the prior administration, and to allow anyone to make that comparison is not just disgusting, it's wrong.
Brendan?
Yeah, so a couple of things, and as Brad pointed out, this is so such a comprehensive issue. We could spend the whole hour talking about it, so I'll just try to get a few brief points. First is, as you probably already know, I'm fully supportive of comprehensive immigration reform. Not just am I supportive of it, the solid majority of American people are supportive of it. For as vitriolic a debate that has surrounded this issue since roughly about 15 years, when under the second George W. Bush administration, so we're now going back several presidential administrations, you had the Kennedy-McCain effort, two senators who obviously were legendary, but are no longer even alive. So that's how long we've been grappling with this. So since that first Kennedy-McCain bipartisan effort about 15 years ago through today, it has continued to have majority support, and ironically nowadays actually has its highest level support in the high 60s. Now, will we get comprehensive immigration reform? It will pass the House. I'm confident. In addition to these more piecemeal measures that actually have much greater popularity. The question is what happens in the Senate. Of course, it brings us back, as a lot of these questions do, to the filibuster question. Although I have to say, on this, even if you didn't have a filibuster, I think it's actually still a challenge to get to 51 when we talk about the comprehensive immigration reform and what exactly is in there. If I were to offer a prediction, I would say I'm much more confident about things like the Dream Act and a few other more tailored measures getting passed and signed into law. And finally, I would just point out, because I think sometimes the media glosses over this, the problem, as Jill and Brad were alluding to, is not, while it's involves our southern border, which obviously is with Mexico, it's not Mexican immigration to the U.S. There was a lot of Mexican immigration to the U.S. 15, 20 years ago. That is almost net zero nowadays. It's really from the three triangle countries in Central America that are going through Mexico to arrive at our southern border. That is the big flow of immigration today. And so, to the extent that the US can help those triangle countries, that has to be part of the overall solution.
Can we get resources legislatively to those countries? Because that seems to be a huge part of it with gangs. There was something in the news today about, a 10-year-old girl was threatened with rape if the brother didn't join a gang. It seems to me that during the Trump era, that was really ignored. And I don't know if there's any legislation or whether it comes more from the executive or where that would come from to deal with this foreign policy issue.
Yeah, I'll say just quickly, and I've spoken about this, I certainly would support greater security assistance for those countries. The good thing is you can actually do that not needing legislation. You can do that as part of our appropriations process. I don't know if Brad has.
No, Brandon, I agree. And it's not just security in those countries. We're talking about U.S. security as well. These gangs are a threat across borders. Unfortunately, we're just in this moment now where people talk about investments. If it's not easily understood as investments here at home, they don't understand the indirect risks. So we gotta make sure, going back to the earlier question, what can we do as Democrats, is make sure we're communicating that it's an interconnected world and the U.S. is better served, our security interests are better protected when we are leading in the world.
Great. I'm going to continue along the foreign policy line a little bit here. And I would like to know what both of you would like to see coming out of the Biden administration in terms of Israel and the Middle East, particularly pertaining to the JCPOA and possible peace, in the region with regard to Israel and the Palestinians. Obviously, the Mideast is a very large area. So I'm speaking with regard to Israel more specifically. So first, the Iran deal, and then second, the thoughts on a two-state solution. We'll go with Brendan, then Brett.
Yeah, I think this is probably going to be another, not to speak for him, but I think this is probably going to be another issue where Brad and I see the world very similarly. In terms of the best way to move forward with respect to Iran, obviously a lot of attention is devoted to the nuclear issue, and for good reason. But it's not the only issue. And so I have joined a letter arguing that let's have an agreement with Iran, but a comprehensive one that affects that deals with their illegal missile program, that deals with the nuclear program, and that also deals with their incredibly malign and destabling activity in the region, indeed, support for terrorism all around the world. Working with the rest of the P5+1, I'm pretty confident that we could finally arrive in a place where we do that. I also have to say, just an observation, I remember back from the JCPOA, which, believe it or not, that was 6 years ago now. And in meeting with a number of constituents of mine, especially from within the Jewish community, but not exclusively, within the Jewish community. It was a very divisive time and debate, and I have friends and supporters who are good Jewish Democrats, some of whom won't even talk to one another, that came out of that incredible division. So I think I'm very anxious to see us arrive in a place in which we have a great agreement that we can stick to, but also not repeat the sort of internal division that we saw that frankly I just don't think is really healthy for anyone.
Brad?
Thanks. Not to make light, but Brendan, you're talking about Jews not talking to each other. Remind me when I see you to tell the story of the deserted island with 2 synagogues and 1 castaway, which most people will know. But in all seriousness, on Iran, Iran is one of the greatest threats in the world, certainly in the Middle East, and is an existential threat to Israel. And so Brendan and I are absolutely united, as I think is the Congress, that we have to make sure Iran never, ever gets a nuclear weapon. That's going to take U.S. involvement. The U.S. can't do it alone. We need the world to come together to ensure that. With respect to the JCPOA, the administration has said that they are willing to go back into the agreement as a path, as a stepping stone to addressing Iran's nuclear program and other issues. But that can't happen until Iran comes into compliance with the JCPOA. Right. That means taking down the centrifuges that are not allowed in operation, getting rid of their highly enriched uranium completely, bringing back their low enriched uranium to the thresholds that's permitted, allowing the IEA inspectors in to do the work that they have to do, and then moving forward. But it's more than just the nuclear fuel program. It's ballistic missiles. It's their support of terrorists in the region, their undermining activities in the region. It's their human rights activity. We have to address all of those. And I think Congress has an important role to ensure that the United States stays focused, and that the Iranians know that we are united, Democrats and Republicans, in the belief that Iran will never be permitted to have a nuclear weapon. But as we talk, as we talk about what's happening in Iran, we're in a new period in the Middle East, the Abraham Accords. Many of us on this call remember the first peace agreement with Egypt, the second peace agreement with Jordan, and it's been 27 years since that agreement was signed. And for the first time, we now have normalization agreements with UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, and the possibility of expanding those. The dynamic in the Middle East has changed profoundly. And so, yes, Israel is our most important ally in the region, one of our most important allies in the world. Yes, the United States is unequivocally committed to Israel's security and pursuing the prospects for peace with its neighbors, including the Palestinians. And I think we have a real opportunity to build on the Abraham Accords to try to create normalization between Israel and her neighbors, successfully having delinked this idea that Israel can't make peace in the region until they resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, giving the Palestinians a veto. And I think hopefully what changes is the Palestinians understand that this is a moment to come to the table and negotiate with the Israelis. And the United States has an important role to play there to try to get to that negotiated two-step solution. So there's so much we are trying to do in the region at a time where we're also facing critical issues around the world. We need to have that strategic balance, understanding the threats from great power rivalries that have reemerged to the near power rivalries that are in existence, rebuilding our alliances and undoing so much of the damage of the Trump administration. We can do all those things and still play a very active, constructive, engaged role in trying to pursue peace in the Middle East.
Great. We could talk to both of you probably for another 2 hours because there's so much to talk about, but this is unfortunately going to have to be our last question. It's more of a general question about democracy. You know, we need a functioning two-party system really for American democracy to work. And there was recently an article, I believe it was in the newspaper today, saying that, and Brad, you were quoted in the article, talking about how many Democrats and Republicans are no longer working together and no longer co-sponsoring legislation because they don't want to work with people who deny the existence of the legitimacy, of the presidential election. Are you able to work with your GOP colleagues? Is there anyone left to work with? Are there any areas of common ground? This is a great concern because as much as many of us have, not good feelings to the GOP, we still want our government to work. I'll start with you, Brendan, and then we'll go to Brad.
Yeah, so the good news is, yes, there still are Republican members who you can work with. I right now, actually, just a couple hours ago, co-led an effort recognizing the 10-year anniversary of the Syrian war. The Republican who co-leads this effort with me in an effort to get the U.S. to do more to help us find a peaceful resolution there is Adam Kinzinger. And obviously from Illinois, and someone who was a real profile and courage in terms of how he voted on impeachment. There are individuals like that still in the Congress. I also draw a distinction between those Republicans who may not have voted for impeachment, but still voted to, uphold democracy, like recognizing the legally cast and counted electoral votes from my state, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which remarkably was still challenged even after the insurrection, the only state that they challenged the electoral votes from. And when I spoke that night, or actually early morning, from January 6th into January 7th, it was little past midnight, and I talked about the fact that this was not a vote between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. We were voting as to whether or not we would remain a representative democracy. And so I say that because it is difficult for me to then rush and work with a Republican member who was rushing, frankly, to get rid of the legally cast votes from my state. I draw a distinction, though, between them and other Republicans. And I also draw a distinction between them and those Republicans like Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz and Mo Brooks and others who actively fed in to this sort of hysteria and the big lie that was perpetrated. So I think there's a spectrum on the Republican side. This is my 13th year in elective office, and I've never had a litmus test. I've always been willing to work with any Republican under the view that, well, if I disagree with him or her on 99% of the issues, well, if we can work together on this 1%, that's better for my district, better for our state, better for our country. I have to say, though, I'm probably like a number of my Democratic colleagues that are reevaluating that insofar as those Republican members who voted on January 6th, again, to end our representative democracy. I think that this situation really is different. And I'm one of a number of colleagues that are wrestling with what exactly that practically means and how we move forward, not just as a member of government who wants to see government work, but frankly, as fellow Americans. How we move forward from this point, I think in many ways it's perhaps the big issue of our time.
Brad, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, I will. And I didn't see the article, but I know the story that's been floating around. And, I was in the Capitol on January 6th when everything went down. Like Brandon, I went back that night on the 6th and 7th to vote against the efforts to overturn the election. And I've been struggling with this. So I think, if you put it in the context of there's a decision tree, you start with two types of members of the Republican conference right now, those who voted to overturn the election and those who didn't. So I start with 139 who voted to overturn the election. I think you can break them into two groups. Those who were sincere in their own mind why they were doing this. I'll come back to that in a second. and those who were cynical, literally doing it to steal an election with clear intent. For the latter group, I have no interest in engaging them. They are, in my mind, people who have disregarded the Constitution and will do anything they can to hold power. For these others, I talked to several, and Brendan mentioned the idea of people trying to overturn the election in Pennsylvania. Some of these people, their narrative is, look, the Constitution says that only legislatures can determine how electors are selected. And governors, judges, others besides the state legislature, secretaries of state in places like Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, took actions that were not sanctioned by the legislature, and therefore those elections were invalid. To which I responded, I would have more faith in the legitimacy of your belief in this if you were taking issue with Ohio, where the governor changed the date of the primary unilaterally, in Texas, where the governor chose where you could and could not put ballot boxes, in Florida, where the governor issued a executive order in June affecting the way electors were going to be selected. You got to be consistent. And so that's why, even though they may have been sincere, and they really are, if you talk to them, they really say, we were just protesting because we want to make sure we get it right in the future. I don't hold it all. I don't give it much water, but I give them the possibility. I don't want to say I will never work with you again. And that's where I came up with my minimum threshold for saying I'm going to work with someone. If you are not willing to concede that Joe Biden is the legitimately elected president of the United States, it's really hard for me to think how I might work with you presenting legislation or writing a letter or leading a task force going to the administration that you don't accept as legitimate. We have to accept the outcomes of our elections. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose, and we live to fight another day. And if we undermine those elections, we really are undermining our democracy. So that is my threshold. And I'll close with a quick example. Is a member from Georgia who voted to overturn, who I said I was going to work with. We had a conversation. I will talk to anyone. I'm not going to stop talking to these people. And he actually showed me and demonstrated he has accepted Biden as legitimate election. He explained why. He would fall into that sincere group. I challenged him on his logic, but I can't disenfranchise his 700,000 constituents and say, I'm not going to work with you. We find a path forward. But you have to at least accept the president, accept the Constitution, and stop trafficking in lies. And if you can't do those three things, I'm not interested in having a relationship.
Great.
Thank you very much, Brad.
Thank you, Brendan and Brad. I'm going to turn it over to Steve to conclude. And just remember, there are donation links in the chat to both these wonderful elected officials. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you very much. What a great conversation. Now you can see why DJOP and Politics with Dane and Steve are such fans of Brad and Brendan. You could read more about the issues we discussed in my weekly Sunday morning newsletter, the Chicagoland Pro-Israel Political Update, which all of you will now be receiving as our gift to you. But before then, we need your help. The party that does not control the White House tends to suffer in the midterms because no president can do everything. But since the president isn't on the ballot or campaigning to tell his side of the story, voters take it out on his party. And it's worse when the president's party controls Congress. On top of that, we have redistricting, which means that Brad and Brendan will have to introduce themselves to new voters. Now, the good news is that both Brad and Brendan do have all the money they need to win in 2022. The bad news is that some of that money is still in your pockets. So I'm going to ask you to dig deep, open your checkbook, get out your credit card, rob the kid's college account, spend that stimulus check, and give all you can to these two wonderful candidates. To do that, you've got in the chat all the links to contribute to both of them. And you can also, I'm sure, I hope that the campaigns or Jill will send everyone who attended a reminder email letting them know how they can contribute. And it's really, you saw this, and it would be a shame not to have them both back in the next session. So please open your hearts, open your wallets, and give all you can. And by the way, last thing I'll say, of course, if you're economically disadvantaged, we know some people can't. It's okay if you don't. It really is. But if you can, please help. Thank you very, very much.
And thank you, everyone. If you want to rewatch this video, it will be on the DJOP YouTube page, and I will send out an email with the links. And the next DJOP event is April 29th on how to turn our state houses blue with Dan Squadron of Future Now and State Rep Jared Solomon and Mitch Cates of the PA Democratic Party. So thank you again, Congressman. We were thrilled to have you. Thank you, Dana and Steve, and thank you all, and good night.
Jill, Dana, Steve, thank you all so much.
Good night.